Utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a moral theory that focuses on the results or consequences of our actions and treats intentions as irrelevant. But what weighs more, doing good or bad? In utilitarianism, good consequences is equal to good actions. Therefore, we can say that in utilitarianism, there is nothing such as good or bad because it all depends on the effect or consequences of the act. Modern utilitarianism was founded in the 18th century by British philosophers Jeremy Bentham, born and died on 1748-1832, and John Stuart Mill, born and died 1806-1873. They were both important theorists and social reformers. John Stuart Mill, or J.S. Mill, was born in London in 1806 and educated privately by his father. Also, he was the most influential liberal philosopher of the 19th century, who wrote on Liberty, 1859, A System of Logic, 1843, The Principles of Political Economy, 1848, The Subjection of Women, 1869, and Utilitarianism, 1863. There are two types of utilitarianism. 1. Utilitarianism, and 2. Rule utilitarianism. Now, I am going to discuss rule utilitarianism. Rule utilitarianism follows the rules which will result in the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Rule utilitarian measures the consequences of the act repeated through time as if it were to be followed as a rule whenever similar circumstances arise. To conclude, rule utilitarianism focuses on the effects of types of actions. Also, rule utilitarians adopt a two-part view that stresses the importance of moral rules, which are A. A specific action is morally justified if it conforms a justified moral rule, and B. A moral rule is justified if its inclusion into our moral code would create a more utility than other possible rules, or no rule at all. According to this perspective, we should judge the morality of individual actions by reference to general moral rules, and we should judge particular moral rules by seeing whether their acceptance into our moral code would produce more well-being than other possible rules.
What is the difference between act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism? Act utilitarianism is a utilitarian theory of ethics which states that a person's act is morally right if and only if it produces the best possible results in that specific situation. Rule utilitarianism, on the other hand, is a form of utilitarianism that says that an action is right as it conforms to a rule that leads to the greatest good. To further understand this, let me give you an example. I find 3 women who is wounded but curable and needs my help. No one else is around. Should I help them? Since helping the women is an immediate matter of life and death, and helping others maximizes happiness in general, I should help the woman. If we pick the action that maximizes happiness in this case, we are in act utilitarianism. Next example is, I have made a promise to meet a friend who is on his deathbed. Should I keep my promise? Since the rule of keeping promises maximizes happiness and is considered the right act, I should keep my promise. In this case, we are in rule utilitarianism. Keynotes to remember. Act utilitarianism applies the utilitarian principle directly to the evaluation of individuals' action. Rule utilitarianism applies the utilitarian principle directly to the evaluation of rules and then evaluate individuals' action by seeing if they obey or disobey those rules whose acceptance will produce the most utility.
Rule utilitarianism, pros and cons. The pros of rule utilitarianism is that a principle of utility is used to evaluate rules which will be standards of individuals' action and not directly evaluates individuals' actions. While the Cons of rule utilitarianism is that rules are subject to continuous changes until determined which rules has the greatest number of utility maximized. To explain further, when a rule utilitarian is compelled to break a rule, he or she will be forced to modify the rule in order to repair the theory. This rule modifying will continue as long as there are situations where the rules do not produce the greatest utility. The rule for promise keeping, for example, would be of the form, always keep your promises except. With a very long list of exceptions, the rule breaking is necessary in order to maintain the greatest utility. Also, rule utilitarian refrains people from acts that might maximize utility in the short run, and instead it follows rules that will maximize utility for the majority of the time. While the cons of rule utilitarianism is the one objection that in some situations the utility of breaking a certain rule could be greater than keeping it. It is, for example, not difficult to imagine that a rule utilitarian who lives by the rule tell the truth sometimes will find him or herself forced to lie in order to increase utility. John Smart argues that refusal to break a generally beneficial rule in cases where it would be beneficial to do so seems irrational for a utilitarian and is a form of rule worship.
Arguments for rule utilitarianism. Rule utilitarianism sounds absurd. It says that we can produce more beneficial results by following rules than by always performing individual actions whose results are as beneficial as possible. This suggests that we should not always perform individual actions that maximize utility. How could this be something that a utilitarian would support? One of the arguments for real utilitarianism is that why does it maximize utility? In spite of this paradox, real utilitarianism possesses its own appeal, and its focus on moral rules can sound quite plausible. The real utilitarian approach to morality can be illustrated by considering the rules of the road. If we are devising a code for drivers, we can adopt either open-ended rules like drive safely or specific rules like stop at red lights, do not drive when drunk, and etc. The rule drive safely, like the utilitarian principle, is a very general rule that leaves it up to individuals to determine what the best way to drive in each circumstances. More specific rules that require stopping at lights, forbid going faster than 30 miles per hour, or prohibit driving while drunk do not give drivers the discretion to judge what is best to do. They simply tell drivers what to do or not do while driving. The reason why a more rigid rule-based system leads to greater overall utility is that people are notoriously bad at judging what is the best thing to do when they are driving a car. Having specific rules maximizes utility by limiting drivers' discretionary judgments and thereby decreasing the ways in which drivers may endanger themselves and others. A rule utilitarian can illustrate this by considering the difference between stop signs and yield signs. Stop signs forbid drivers to go through an intersection without stopping, even if the driver sees that there are no cars approaching and thus no danger in not stopping. A yield sign permits drivers to go through without stopping unless they judge that approaching cars make it dangerous to drive through the intersection. The key difference between these signs is the amount of discretion that they give to the driver. The stop sign is like the rule utilitarian approach. It tells drivers to stop and does not allow them to calculate whether it would be better to stop or not. The yield sign is like act utilitarianism. It permits drivers to decide whether there is a need to stop. Utilitarians see the stop sign as too rigid, because it requires drivers to stop even when nothing bad will be prevented. The result, they say, is a loss of utility each time a driver stops at a stop sign when there is no danger from oncoming cars. Real utilitarians will reply that they would reject the stop sign method for two reasons. If people could be counted on to drive carefully, and if traffic accidents only caused limited amounts of harm. But they say neither of this is true, because people often drive too fast and are inattentive while driving because they are, for example, talking, texting, listening to music, or tired. We cannot count on people to make good utilitarian judgments about how to drive safely. In addition, this costs the disutility of accidents can be very high. Accident victims, including drivers, may be killed, injured, or disabled for life. For these reasons, rural utilitarians support the use of stop signs and other non-discretionary rules under some circumstances. Overall, these rules generate greater utility because they prevent more disutility from accidents than they create from unnecessary stops. Real utilitarians generalize from this type of case and claim that our knowledge of human behavior shows that there are many cases in which general rules or practices are more likely to promote good effects than simply telling people to do whatever they think is best in each individual case. But this does not mean that real utilitarians always support rigid rules without exceptions. Some rules can identify types of situations in which the prohibition is overridden. In emergency medical situation, for example, a driver may justifiably go through a red light or stop sign based on the driver's own assessment that A. This can be done safely, and B. The situation is one in which even a short delay might cause dire or urgent harms. So the correct rule need not be never go through a stop, but rather can be something like never go through a stop sign except in cases that have properties A and B. To sum it all up, the rule utilitarian can allow departures from rules and will leave many choices up to the individuals. In such cases, people may act in the manner that looks like the approach supported by utilitarians. Nonetheless, these discretionary actions are permitted because having a rule in these cases does not maximize utility or because the best rule may impose some constraints on how people act while still permitting a lot of discretion in deciding what to do.
So now I'm going to tackle about how rural utilitarianism avoids the criticism that is brought to utilitarianism. So let me give you a quick preview about the differences of utilitarianism and rural utilitarianism. Utilitarianism claims that an individual's act is morally right only if it produces the best possible results out of a certain situation. While on the other hand, rural utilitarianism claims that an action is considered right as it conforms to a rule that leads to the greatest good. So I'm going to show you a quick illustration about utilitarianism to have a clearer view about its concept. So you are walking home and you stumble upon this 5 homeless guy that is begging for money and you happen to have a change. So there's this two circumstances that you could do. You could either give the majority of the money to one of the guys or give him all the money then leave, or give the majority of the money and give the remaining small amount equally to the other guys, or you could divide it equally to each one of them. So in utilitarianism, it focuses more on the maximization of happiness of more individuals. In the first circumstances, it only fulfill more in the need of one of the guys. While on the other hand, the second choice fulfill more individuals than just one. So in utilitarianism, the action must be the second choice, second situation. So if you're going to look at this illustration, you would think that, oh, utilitarianism seems fair and rational concept. But if you're going to look at it in different view and different circumstances, that is when people started to criticize this concept. Like for example, in judges, doctors, and promise makers. Let me give you an illustration. So you are a lawyer and
this girl is that you're defending is accusing an innocent man, and there are many people that is, sympathizing with her, but it is clear in your head that this man doesn't do anything wrong and didn't do what he is accused. But in act utilitarianism, it doesn't matter what kind of action as long it is it brought the best result or the maximization of happiness of the people. So it is okay if you lie to punish an innocent person just to get the best happiness and the maximum happiness. How about in doctors? You are a doctor and you have a patient who need different organs transfusions, and you happen to have a patient that is very healthy. So in act utilitarianism, it is again important to have the majority be happy. So whatever action, like per se, you kill this person, sacrifice this person's life just to save more people, it is morally right based on the act utilitarianism. So I hope you can see why this is a problem, because this shows that act utilitarianism, in the view of act utilitarianism, it is rational and morally right to do whatever, to lie, to kill a person, to abuse someone, just to get the maximum happiness. In the view of act utilitarianism, the maximization of happiness of more individuals outweighs the rights of an individual. So you might be asking, how did rule utilitarianism able to, avoid this kind of criticism? Well, you see, as I've mentioned earlier, rule utilitarianism, unlike the act utilitarianism, confirms with rules, and it stresses the value of general rules and practices that maximize overall utility. So let's go back to the doctor illustration. So you were a doctor and you did manage to kill the healthy patient and save the 4 other patients. So what will happen next is people will start to not trust doctors, and less people will go to get medical help in fear of this act that they might be killed just to get the maximum happiness. So that per se, it shows that action not only doesn't comply with the rules of not killing a person just to save the others, it also doesn't maximize the overall utility. Therefore, in rule utilitarianism, it is not right. It is not the right move. So that is how rule utilitarianism avoid criticism about this, because it cares about the after effect and the maximized utility, and it also focus on the rules, the general rules and practices, unlike the act utilitarianism. So moving forward, moreover, the next criticism that we're going to focus about now is about the maintaining versus the undermining trust. So you can see rule utilitarianism, it looks at and it cares about the social impact of the action, unlike the act utilitarianism. And other than that, rule utilitarianism, key values is the rule-based morality. So act utilitarianism is being criticized of how it undermines, the basic rules or the fundamental morality or ethics, like trust, and how it undermines it, especially in this kind of fields like judges, doctors, and other promise makers, which is trust is very important. So unlike act utilitarianism, who doesn't care about, the rule-based morality, rule utilitarianism managed to maintain the trust to these certain individuals, which is very important. So this is how rule utilitarianism able to avoid that kind of problems. And so last but not the least, criticism that is upon act utilitarianism is about its impartiality and the problem of over-demandingness that it gives to us. So as you can see, act utilitarianism is said to have exaggerated demands on humans' nature. You see, as humans, we have relations, we have emotions and feelings, but in act utilitarianism, it's very objective, it's very impartial, that you have to think about everyone regardless of your feelings and your emotions. And it is very hard as for us humans to comply to this kind of concept. So rule utilitarianism was able to avoid the criticism about impartiality and over-demandingness of act utilitarianism, as it allows partiality towards ourselves and those who are closely related to us. Moreover, it justifies the partiality without rejecting the impartiality tradition of utilitarianism. So you might be thinking, like, how is it possible that partiality and impartiality be applied in the role of utilitarianism? So Brad Hooker actually conceptualized in which he applied partiality and impartiality in the concept of rule of utilitarianism. So you see, he claims that the justification moral rules will remain impartial, but the application of those moral rules could be partially applied. So to have more clearer view or clearer understanding of it, I will show a illustration. So here you go. So in this illustration, it focuses on the argument about division of labor. So you are a teacher, and you are assigned to a particular class to teach them. So you have a duty to educate these children, but you don't have the duty to teach and educate other students other than what you're assigned for. So in rule of utilitarianism, it allows a person to have a priority and have a partial application. Unlike act of utilitarianism, you see in this illustration, if the teacher tried to teach each and every student, there is a chance that she is not equipped and well educated not to teach all of them. So that doesn't maximize the utility, which what rule of utilitarianism aims. So in short, rule of utilitarianism avoided the overly demandingness and the impartialist problem or criticism to act of utilitarianism by allowing people to have priorities and act partially. But it doesn't mean that if you are committed in imperialist justification moral, doesn't mean that you cannot act and apply it partially and have priorities and maximize utility. So that is all for this topic. So next reporter, please.
Rule utilitarianism arguably solves some of the problems of utilitarianism, but it also opens itself up to a whole new set of objections, and today we will consider a few of the most notable ones. Arguments against rule utilitarianism are divided into three. The first one is the rule worship objection, the second one, the collapses into utilitarianism objection, and for the last one is the wrong answers and crude concepts. Utilitarianism stated that we should follow the code of rules that will bring about the most happiness, but utilitarians criticize rule utilitarians for irrationally supporting rule-based actions in cases where more good could be done by violating the rule than obeying it, and they see this as a form of rule worship and irrational deference to rules that has no utilitarian justification. Rule utilitarianism does not use utility as its way of assessing actions. One may refrain from killing someone because in general, killing is bad for utility. In this case, rule utilitarianism says that you are doing the right thing because you are following the right rule. However, there clearly are times when one could create more utility, meaning one could create more happiness in breaking the rule rather than obeying it. For example, if you are being asked to shoot a suicide bomber before they cause an explosion killing dozens of people, utility demands that you should shoot. If utility demands it, so you should utilitarianism, but rule utilitarianism does not. Way of explaining rule utilitarianism or the objections against it is suppose that there's a rule that usually brings about happiness when it is obeyed, but in some particular cases, it is definitely going to bring about more happiness if one should break the rule, just like what I have explained earlier. For instance, another example, it will usually lead to most happiness if people obey the simple rule, don't steal. But imagine in the present circumstances, it is clear that stealing will lead to more happiness, for it's the only way to feed a starving person. For example, Robin Hood, stealing from the rich in order to help the poor. If the person says that we should stick to the rule that don't steal even though it will lead to less happiness, she can be accused or he can be accused of rule of worship. Another example, suppose that the general rule is to not lie, and as Kant stated, lie and any form of lying is bad, and saying, for example, your friend who has an abusive husband ran over to your house in order to escape, and minutes later the husband appeared in front of your house asking if his wife is in there, and as a friend you have to say no in order to save your friend, which made you break the rule, which leads us to the conclusion that Utilitarianism wanted to free us from oppressive moral codes that sometimes ask us to make the world a worse place in the name of some nebulous idea. Anyone who is appalled by religious zealots harming others or who cannot understand why their over honest friends keeps upsetting people understand why following the rules is not always right. The second one, which is the collapses into a utilitarianism objection. According to this criticism, although rule utilitarianism looks different from utilitarianism, a careful examination shows that it collapses into, or as David Lyons claimed, is extensionally equivalent to utilitarianism. So using the example given in the rule worship objection, if the person said that we should break the simple rule against stealing in these circumstances, perhaps the rule we should obey is instead, you should not steal unless doing so will bring about more happiness. The argument for collapses is most obviously seen in circumstances where a moral choice is presented that calls two important rules into play. Imagine you can spare your friends' feelings from significant hurt by lying to them. Naturally, if they discover your lie, you'll harm some trust you share and also somewhat hurt their feelings. It is unclear what the expected utility of each action is. So now you have two rules you could follow: the don't lie or don't hurt your friends' feelings unnecessarily. Add a third dimension to this. Your friend is asking you what another friend has said about them. Now you also have to consider the rules of don't gossip and two conflicting examples of support your friend. Now, if rule utilitarianism is to be distinct from utilitarianism, its supporters must find a way to formulate rules that allow exceptions to a general requirement or prohibition while not collapsing into utilitarianism. One way to do this is to identify specific conditions under which violating a general more requirement would be justified. Instead of following the general rule, do not lie, rule utilitarians must obey. Do not lie except to prevent severe harms to people who are not unjustifiably threatening others with severe harm. Third one, which is wrong answers and crude concepts. Although rule utilitarians try to avoid the weaknesses attributed to utilitarianism, critics argue that they cannot avoid these weaknesses because they do not take seriously many of our central moral concepts, and as a result, they cannot support the right answers to crucial moral problems. Three prominent concepts in moral thought that critics cite are justice, rights, and desert. These moral ideas are often invoked in reasoning about morality, but critics claim that neither rule nor utilitarianism acknowledge their importance. Instead, they focus only on the amounts of utility that actions or rules generate. Considering this case, for example, of punishing innocent people, the best that rule utilitarians can do is to say that a rule that permits this would lead to a worse results overall than a rule that permitted it. This prediction, however, is precarious. While it may be true, it may be false, and if it falls, then utilitarians must acknowledge that intentionally punishing an innocent person could sometimes be morally justified. In addition, critics object to utilitarianism by claiming that the theory justifies treating people unjustly, violating their rights, and etc. This criticism only stands up if it always wrong and thus never morally justified to treat people in these ways. Utilitarians argue that moral common sense is less absolute than the critics acknowledge. In this case of punishment, for example, while we hope that our system of criminal justice gives people fair trials and conscientiously accepts to separate the innocent from the guilty, we know that the system is not perfect, and as a result, people who are innocent are sometimes prosecuted, convicted, and punished for crimes they did not do. The problem of wrongful convictions, which poses a difficult challenge to critics of utilitarianism. If we know that our system of criminal justice punishes some people unjustly and in ways they do not deserve, we are faced with a dilemma. It is either we can shut down the system and punish no one, or we can maintain the system even though we know that it will result in some innocent people being unjustly punished in ways that they do not deserve. Though in the end, utilitarians say it is justice and rights that give way when rules that approve of violations in some cases yield the greatest amounts of utility.
Summary. What is rule utilitarianism? Rule utilitarianism is a form of utilitarianism that says that an action is right as it conforms to a rule that leads to the greatest good. What is the difference between act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism? Act utilitarianism applies the utilitarian principle directly to the evaluation of individuals' action. Rule utilitarianism applies the utilitarian principle directly to the evaluation of rules and then evaluate individuals' action by seeing if they obey or disobey those rules whose acceptance will produce the most utility. The pros and cons of rule utilitarianism. The pros is principle of utility is used to evaluate rules which will be the standards of individuals' action and not directly evaluate individuals' actions. The cons is rules are subject to continuous changes including rule breaking until determine which rules has the greatest number of utility maximized. The arguments for rule utilitarianism. Number 1. Rule utilitarianism maximizes utility for the reasons that people are notoriously bad at judging on the spot, and having more rigid, rule-based system leads to greater overall utility. Having these rules limits people's discretionary judgment by having default decisions, which decreases the ways in which they can endanger others and themselves. Number 2. Rule utilitarianism avoids the criticism of act utilitarianism because of 3 reasons. A. Approves of actions that are clearly wrong. B. Undermines trust among people. And C. Is too demanding because it requires people to make excessive levels of sacrifice. Arguments against rule utilitarianism. Number 1. Rule worship objections. Act utilitarians criticize rule utilitarians for rule worship, or irrationally supporting rule-based actions in cases where more good could be done by violating the rule than obeying it. Act utilitarian says that they recognize that rules can have values. Rules can provide a basis for acting when there is no time to deliberate. In addition, rules can define a default position, a justification for doing or refraining from a type of action as long as there is no reason for not doing it. But when people know that more good can be done by violating the rule, then the default position should be overridden. 2. Collapses into act utilitarianism. Since rule utilitarians are subject to continuous changes including rule breaking until determine which rules has the greatest number of utility maximized, rule utilitarians face difficult challenges in formulating utility-based rules that have a reasonable degree of complexity built into them but are not so flexible that they can collapse into act utilitarianism. 3. Wrong answers and crude concepts. Although rule utilitarians try to avoid the weaknesses attributed to act utilitarianism, critics argue that they cannot avoid these weaknesses because they do not take seriously many of our central moral concepts. As a result, they cannot support the right answers to crucial moral problems. In the case of punishment as a rule, for example, according to rule utilitarian, this can only be justified if a rule that permits punishment after a fair trial or etc. yields more overall utility than a rule that rejects punishment because it treats some people unfairly. While we hope that our system of criminal justice gives people fair trials and conscientiously attempts to separate the innocent from guilty, we know that the system is not perfect. As a result, people who are innocent sometimes are prosecuted convicted, and punished for the crimes they did not do. Either we can shut down the system and punish no one, or we can maintain the system even though we know that it will result in some innocent people being unjustly punished in a way that they do not deserve, which is a rough or inexpert plan of execution.